looking for the cue to start, but I think I'm okay. Norbert, you ready? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda Stewart, the Chief Executive of the Policing Board, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our offices today for this, the third of our seminar series, and this one themed on local policing delivering for local communities. A particularly warm welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and also those of you who are joining us on the live stream. Many of you will know we have chosen the topics for the seminar series that are clearly linked to the measures that the board set for the Chief Constable in the annual policing plan, and they are there to develop against the long-term strategic outcomes for policing, which are embedded within a policing the community ethos. In terms of the proceedings for today, I'll give you a quick overview. We're going to kick off with a short film which really just sets the context of local policing. We will then be joined by the Director of the Police Foundation, Dr. Rick Muir, and Rick is going to provide a national perspective in respect of neighbourhood policing. We will then go straight to questions and answers from the floor. However, I'll be asking the Board Chair, Anne Conley, and ACC Alan Todd to join the panel, and they will be happy along with Rick to take any questions that you may have. It is a lunchtime seminar. I am planning to finish at about 1:45 to let you all get back to wherever you came from. As is usual, the panellists, board members and other people were happy to stay about at the end. If you have any questions that you want to raise or you don't get an opportunity to put your question, we will be here to take those at the end for a short time. Just finally, in terms of practical arrangements for today, we have no fire drill planned. If the alarm goes off, I would just ask you to leave the building following the directions from our staff. And you will also notice that photography has been taken, which has been used for the board in our online publications and also our print documents. If you do not wish to appear in the photography, if you could let either myself or a member of staff know, we will make sure that that doesn't happen. And as I mentioned at the start, we are live streaming and on our YouTube channel. You're very welcome to make comments on Twitter using the hashtags NIPDLive and hashtags Policing Matters and tagging us at NI Policing Board. Thank you, and we will now see a short film.
How the police engage and interact with the community is central to building confidence in policing and to tackling crime and criminality. Policing with community has been central to policing reform in Northern Ireland, which recognises the importance of embedding policing teams in local areas to build relationships and engage with local people. This means police participating in the community and responding to their needs. It also means the community getting involved in policing and supporting the police. Good policing depends on that all-important community input and information, and working with key agencies to get a grip on issues that people are concerned about in their neighbourhoods. To be really effective, policing needs to stay connected to the community. Without that connection, trust, confidence, victim satisfaction, and the ability to manage community tensions becomes more difficult. Replacing response teams with 34 new neighbourhood policing teams across the 11 districts in 2015 was designed to place officers at the heart of communities. 26 dedicated local policing teams were put in to support areas with higher levels of crime and deprivation. How the police evolve and change needs to match changes in society. Technology is now a key part of officers' work and provides new opportunities for the police and the public to engage and share information. While neighbourhood policing is widely considered to be the bedrock of policing, more complex demands, changing crime types, evolving technology and shrinking budgets means policing must develop how it delivers. It's important to ask what the longer term impact of such change is and what the community now expect and need from their policing service. Is police investment in neighbourhoods as important as it was? Do the police still have the means to understand changing and emerging communities? We'll now hear from Dr. Rick Muir from the Police Foundation, who will share his insights.
Thank you. As we heard, just by way of introduction, Rick Muir is the Director of the Police Foundation, and for those of you that are not familiar with the Foundation, it is an independent think tank focused exclusively on improving policing. The Police Foundation works with a range of partners from across policing, carrying out independent research to inform police policy and practice, and creating public debate about policing, which is really, in a sense, what we're doing here today. Rick will speak specifically on the first product from the Police Foundation's 2017 research project on the future of neighbourhood policing.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the very kind invitation to Belfast. This is the third time I've been here, each time at the invitation of the policing board, and it's always great to be here. And the hospitality has always been so nice that I've always said yes whenever I've been asked to come again. So thank you very much for that. What I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes is a project that we've been carrying out at the Police Foundation on neighbourhood policing in England and Wales. But I think, as you'll see, the themes very much resonate with the kind of debates that you're having here in Northern Ireland as well around the future of neighbourhood policing. We come at this thinking about what's happened to neighbourhood policing in England and Wales since the National Neighbourhood Policing Project and Programme was introduced in 2008. And you may remember at the time it was a Labour government, introduced neighbourhood policing. There was a very standardised model of neighbourhood policing which was rolled out. Every ward in England and Wales was to have a certain number of police community support officers, a certain number of constables. There was a clear focus around improving the visibility of policing, improving community engagement, and encouraging this idea of problem-solving policing. And that was, as I say, 2008. That's a very long time ago in all sorts of ways, politically, a very, very long time ago. The police service in England and Wales has recently produced this Policing Vision 2025, which talks about the kind of policing that they want to see in the next decade, by the sort of middle of the 2020s. And it sets out, again, a vision for neighbourhood policing. It talks about neighbourhood policing. It talks a bit more about issues like trying to understand community needs, trying to ensure that neighbourhood policing plays a role in proactive prevention of social problems and prevention of crime before it takes place. And also, crucially, this notion of whole place integration, and there's a big emphasis on this, and I know it's something that will be familiar here as well, around how do all the agencies of the state and the community work together to tackle complex problems. Problems which can't be solved by the police, they can't be solved by the health service, they can't be solved by employment services or whatever on their own, but require a holistic response. And so that's a key feature of the Vision for Neighbourhood Policing by 2025. And in a way we stand in between these 2 points, the original neighbourhood policing programme and this vision of where we want to end up by 2025. And in 2017, there are a lot of reasons for concern about the state of neighbourhood policing in England and Wales. And you'll see there a quote from HMIC saying that officers are not always available to undertake dedicated crime prevention work in their neighbourhoods, and the work of neighbourhood teams across the service is becoming more irregular, unstructured, and is supported ineffectively by other force resources. So HMIC have said there's a real worry about the state of neighbourhood policing, and this is, of course, largely due to austerity, I think, and the fact that resources have been reduced, and resources overwhelmingly in policing means police officer numbers, and they've had to shed a significant number of officers, which means that neighbourhood policing has been put under pressure. But it's not just austerity, it's also, of course, changing demand. And even though volume crime has fallen in England and Wales, complex crime, sexual crimes, domestic violence incidents that are reported to the police, these kind of offences are increasingly being reported and have to be taken forward. So there's a real resource and demand pressure on policing, and this has led to, in some areas, a reduction in neighbourhood policing in England and Wales. Not in all areas, and it's a mixed picture. What I'm going to show you is an attempt by the Police Foundation to map out what has happened to neighbourhood policing. And the reason we're doing this is because in 2008, we started off with a very clear understanding of what neighbourhood policing meant and what it was supposed to be trying to achieve. Now that is much less clear. There are lots of things that are called neighbourhood policing that don't look very similar to that original neighbourhood policing programme. So what we want to do is to understand what has happened on the ground in communities to neighbourhood policing provision. And so this project, which we're in the midpoint of the project, but I'm going to present the latest data that we have from this. The aims of the project were to chart change, see what's happened, not just since the onset of austerity, but of course also in England and Wales, we had a major change in the governance framework for policing with the introduction of police and crime commissioners. And so whereas in 2008 we had a national model of neighbourhood policing, now that is very much a local decision. If you want neighbourhood policing, that's for the Police and Crime Commissioner to decide locally, and the kind of neighbourhood policing that you want will be determined at the local level. The Home Office won't get involved in it. So you have this reduction in resource, change in demand, and a change in the governance, which means that forces are taking very different approaches now. So we want to find out exactly what they've done. We want to look at the different models and what impact they may have. We're looking at which issues are being prioritised and where resources are being allocated. We want to look in particular at this question of how neighbourhood policing works as part of a system, how it works with other local services and within local communities. And we want to explore the changing needs of communities and how the police are adapting to those. So we've done some stakeholder engagement. What I'm going to show you next is an analysis of 10 years workforce data, which is the data on which roles police officers are allocated to within their forces. Now, there are some issues with that data, and I'll come on, after I show you the data, I'll talk a bit about that, because it's not always clear what forces mean when they say we have X percentage of officers working in neighbourhood roles, because that can mean different things in different places. But we're going to look at the workforce data, and I think it does give you some indication of what's going on. Then we've gone out to forces, and we've done a survey of forces, and we've asked them to give us their interpretation of what's happened. So we've said, we've looked at your data and it looks like this is happening. We've been out to forces and said, how does that sound to you? Give us your, if you like, narrative on what you're trying to do. And we've done focus groups with neighbourhood policing officers, we've done an online survey, and we've done some, if you like, deep dives. We've gone into 6 forces which are trying to introduce different types of neighbourhood policing to talk to them directly. So this is the kind of funky bit of the presentation where things will start moving around. What these dots represent are the workforces, the police workforce in different forces, and the size of the dots indicates the size of the workforce. So the large kind of orange sun, which is at the top, is the Met, which is about 25% of the police workforce, and then so they're all arranged according to size. Don't worry about the colours for the moment. I'll come on and talk about what those colours mean. But the horizontal axis shows the percentage of the police workforce in each police force in England and Wales in what are called neighbourhood roles. And so that's the percentage of officers who are doing a neighbourhood, who are badged as a neighbourhood officer. And the vertical axis shows the percentage of the workforce which are police officers, the percentage of the neighbourhood workforce which are PCSOs as opposed to police officers. So if you like, the horizontal axis is civilianisation, the degree to which they're using police community support officers as opposed to warranted officers to carry out neighbourhood functions. So those are the 2 axes. And what you'll see below is we start in 2008 and we move along. What you'll see is we start off in England and Wales with quite a compact grouping around the centre. So we have a national neighbourhood policing model in which people tend to be apparently doing the same sort of thing. And what you're seeing over time, as austerity bites and we have the change in the governance model and so on, is much greater variation in England and Wales. And in particular, you'll see some forces moving off to the top left, which are increasingly reliant on police community support officers, and this very interesting group of green dots who have a very, very high percentage of their officers, they say, are in neighbourhood roles. So you see here this dispersion. So whereas we had this clustering around a central national model where everyone was pretty much doing the same thing, with some differences, what you see now is variation. I'm going to talk about what's happening in those individual forces. So, you'll see the first thing that's happened is there's a group of forces who have moved off with this kind of, what looks like quite a radical shift to the right there, which is that they've got an increased number of officers who are called neighbourhood police officers. And we call these integrated hybrids. And these are forces who are changing the definition of a neighbourhood role to include response policing often, and to include investigative work as well. So what they're doing is they're taking neighbourhood policing away from being quite a sort of specialised group which is sort of marked off and kept away from kept away from other functions like response, and they've integrated them. And they've integrated, and what you see in these forces is they have a very low, and in some cases no percentage of officers working in response functions. So they're merging their response and neighbourhood functions, essentially. And I'll talk a bit about the consequences of that. Then you'll see what we call civilianised rurals, and these are forces which are very heavily reliant on police community support officers, civilian support officers, to carry out neighbourhood policing. And these tend to be rural forces, and there may be something to do with covering large distances and having PCSOs doing that, while the warranted officers are more in the sort of response functions. You'll see there's all the Welsh forces are in that, and I think that's very specifically because the Welsh Assembly government provided extra funding for PCSOs, so there was money available in Wales to sustain a police community support officer function. But there's also some rural forces, if you like, on the eastern side of England there as well, in that camp. You'll see a group that we call officer preservers, and you'll notice that the Met has sort of dropped down the chart, so it started off at the top and it's fallen down, and that's because the Met's got rid of a lot of its PCSOs, and its PCSOs at one point you had to be a PCSO to actually get recruited to become a constable in the Met. So they were recruiting, they were moving people on from being PCSOs to becoming warranted officers. And these are forces, Merseyside, the Met, and others, which have, where the political direction has been, we're going to retain the number of officers that we've got. So in the Met, Boris Johnson said, we're not going to lose any warranted officers, I'm going to keep the number of officers that we've got, and they did that by reducing back office staff and reducing the number of PCSOs. And we've also seen that in other forces as well. Incidentally, we've also seen that in Scotland, where there's been a very clear commitment from the government to retain the overall number of police officers in the country. So those are the officer preservers. They don't tend to have actually moved too far in terms of percentage in neighbourhood roles, interestingly. Then we have what we call consistent traditionals, and these haven't really moved anywhere at all. And it's interesting that actually some of the highest performers, if you look at HMIC ratings of neighbourhood policing, some of the best performing forces in terms of neighbourhood policing are in that group. They've maintained a consistent, Durham is in there, for example, Thames Valley is in there. These are forces that tend to score highly on neighbourhood policing, and they've been pretty consistent. They've maintained the model that they had. There'll be lots of arguments about why that is. Some of them have been a bit better off financially than others, and that might be one of the reasons. We have this group which we call robust purists, which I showed this to the Chief Constable of West Midlands the other day, and he was quite pleased with that label. But people like being called robust. What's happened here is they tend to have a higher proportion of officers in neighbourhood roles. So they've moved and they've put more into neighbourhoods, but they haven't gone for an integrated hybrid model. They've tended to retain neighbourhood policing, and in West Mids, the Chief Constable was very clear about that he wants neighbourhood policing to be ring-fenced, if you like, and they're not given investigative responsibilities, and they're kept away from response work. So that's another little model. And then we have some outliers which just don't really make any sense in our typology. The City of London, well, that's just a bit weird. And Bedfordshire has been all over the place, frankly. I mean, it's moved all over that map because every time it has a new Chief Constable or a new Police and Crime Commissioner, it seems to change its model. At one point it had almost no officers in neighbourhood roles, and it's sort of moving back to that. So Bedfordshire's been in a curious position. So that's the typology. And what we did next was we went in. Now, look, that's based on workforce data. So the Home Office asked the forces to tell them how many of your officers are in these different kinds of roles, response, neighbourhood, and so on. And this is what they've reported, and we've then done an analysis of it. But as I've shown through the typology, what does neighbourhood role mean? And it can mean all sorts of different things in different places. And we can't tell that just from looking at these statistics. So what we've been doing is we've gone into forces which represent different subgroups in our typology to talk to them. We've asked the normally the Assistant Chief Constable with responsibility to tell us about their narrative and what if you like is the sort of official narrative of what's going on. And we've done focus groups with officers to ask them what they think has happened as well. And these are the reflections which have come out. The first thing that's happened is that neighbourhood policing in England and Wales has lost its functional distinctiveness. That whereas in 2008 it started off very much with this idea it's a functionally distinct category of policing. We don't want to see lots of abstractions. We want them to focus on visibility, proactivity, community engagement, and so on. Now, increasingly, it's being integrated into response roles. And the reason we have the waterfall there is that because, and it's understandable incidentally that this has happened because there's less money, right? So what are you going to do? It's hard. It's hard to retain the functional distinctiveness when you've got less money around. But what the waterfall indicates is, if you like, the torrent of demand, because what tends to happen is that people get moved off the proactive stuff by the control room. And you'll see from this constable here who says, it doesn't matter what your role is, the control room, CFPC, is a resource at their disposal to send wherever they want. And that will be familiar. As soon as you put people on those response functions, there's always going to be something urgent and pressing, which is going to end up being prioritised over the neighbourhood work. We call the control room the interrupting cow of neighbourhood policing. In other words, every time they try to work on prevention, neighbourhood policing relies on slow time policing. It's about having the time and space to do planned and structured activity a lot of the time, and if it's done well. But of course, as soon as you allow those officers to be pulled out by the control room, then they tend to be pulled off. And so here you have an example of a sergeant saying, I have a school to go to on X Street where problem children go to learn skills. They felt they hadn't had contact from the police for a while, so I arranged for beat officers to go in and talk to them, and then they were pulled off by the control room. And so the local community is expecting a meeting. It doesn't happen because the officers are pulled away. And there'll be lots of examples of that happening. It becomes very difficult to do planned and preventative work when you're subject to all those very pressing emergency response demands. And what we found in England and Wales is a lot of fixes emerging around this. So we found, for example, in some forces, sergeants have been put back on with responsibility for some of these beat teams, so that there's a buffer between the officers and the control room. In other words, there's someone with more seniority who can sort of fight back against the pressure to send people to the more urgent emergency demands. We've also seen changes in shifts. So in some areas, they've they're taking them, if you like, off shift to give them the so that they can't simply be moved around by the control room. And so there's sort of lots of different, if you like, patches and fixes that are being developed to deal with this. The other big issue which has emerged in this work is this question of, do you want the same model of neighbourhood policing everywhere, in every local community, or should it be targeted on specific communities? And I know that's something which you're sort of managing here as well. And of course, in 2008, before the financial crash, before austerity, when there was more money around, it was possible to have all singing, all dancing neighbourhood policing teams in every single ward in England and Wales. And it was a sergeant, 2 constables and 3 PCSOs were supposed to be in every council ward in England and Wales. And that's a very expensive model. And of course, what we found is it's not possible to sustain that anymore. And that what we've seen in some forces is there is a universal offer, but sometimes it's online. You can talk to an officer, but it'll have to be through digital channels and so on. frankly, if you live in an affluent, leafy suburb, you're not going to get visible neighbourhood policing in the same way as if you live in an area with lots of social problems and lots of crime. And so we've seen a move towards, in some forces, this more targeted model. West Midlands are doing that, Gloucestershire seem to be doing that, and they've got a kind of specialist neighbourhood team who go into particular wards, which seems to be working quite well. On the other hand, we had some forces like the Met, where the Mayor Sadiq Khan has said he wants real neighbourhood policing in every single ward. And I think what we're starting to see in the Met is what we've got there is the pizza dough being stretched. So if you say you're going to put neighbourhood officers in every single ward, what happens is the response function is coming under serious pressure, and we were picking up a lot of concern about that the response function was under a lot of stuff that used to be was getting done by neighbourhoods is now having to be done by response, and response are kind of running around having to deal with that, and so that will impact on response times and all of those sorts of issues. So that is so one of the key questions that needs to be addressed. I think my own view is that universal just isn't affordable. There needs to be some kind of universal offer, but it might be digital, it might be online, it might be a different way of doing it. But you need to there needs to be a neighbourhood policing resource, and it will have to be targeted, I think, in specific areas. Another key theme is integration around complex problems and complex needs. So agencies working together to try to deal with this, particularly, of course, around things like safeguarding children, vulnerable adults, and so on. And so, and we've seen some moves in that direction to see neighbourhood policing has been a hub for that. In Greater Manchester, where they've recently had this devolution deal and where the NHS budget has been devolved down to the Greater Manchester region, they've started these integrated working pilots, and they're doing some quite interesting work led by neighbourhood officers in some parts of the region, but dealing with specific issues like domestic abuse and trying to take a more preventative approach to them. And what you've got is hubs with police officers and social workers and voluntary sector working together and co-locating, sharing information in a much more advanced way than perhaps they have in the past, to try to prevent problems before they get worse. And so we're starting to see neighbourhood policing move and develop in this direction. And it's also, of course, part of that multi-agency working is about prevention, because it's saying that the only way to reduce demand is to work better together. There's often a debate, I think, in policing about, well, what are we going to stop doing? And the fundamental problem with that debate is that society doesn't stop, and there's always going to be emergencies, and the police are always going to be called out when something horrible happens. And it's very hard when that happens to say, well, we're not going to deal with that anymore. But what you can try to do, I think, is to work more effectively with the other agencies. And we're starting to see a bit of that with health, around mental health, and some other areas. So I think neighbourhood policing does play a critical role in that, because they've got the community intelligence, they've got the relationships. One final issue which I'll just mention is this question of whether, in some forces, because they've moved out of neighbourhood policing, whether you're losing, if you like, what we've called here the bushcraft of neighbourhood policing, or the beatcraft might be a better word. There was a point, I think, at which neighbourhood policing was starting to be seen as a bit of a specialism, with specialist skills around it, whereas now we've seen this move to more omnicompetence, everybody's sort of doing everything, and less of that. And we heard concerns from neighbourhood officers that they felt that some of those neighbourhood policing skills around community engagement, around prevention, are being lost. And what can we do to prevent that? It's interesting, the College of Policing is trying to develop structures to allow officers to specialise in neighbourhood policing roles and stay in those roles longer, and looking at pay and rank and all of that. But that's still quite underdeveloped. And I do think this issue of, what skills do you require in neighbourhoods is an important one to have. So some questions just to perhaps provoke discussion when we move into the panel. Should we be aiming for functionally distinct neighbourhood policing? Should we try to do it everywhere, or to do it well where it's most needed? Is the future of neighbourhood policing dependent on a rethinking of how the police deals with calls for service? Because some of the demand will be about thinking about, well, how are we actually managing some of these calls as they're coming in? What should be the police role in more integrated neighbourhood service offer? How do we nurture, promote and recognise neighbourhood skills and capability? And do we need a clearer terminology and more consistent use of language? And one of the things that we want to do in this project is to try to just clarify the concept. What is neighbourhood policing? Because there's a danger that if everyone says they're doing neighbourhood policing, but it means such different things in different places, we just don't understand what it is anymore. We've kind of lost, that's, localism is a good thing. It's important people try different things, but if we're all talking about completely different things, we seem to have lost some conceptual clarity. And through this work, we want to try to, if you like, hone down exactly what it is that we mean by neighbourhood policing and what's required to do it well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. That was really insightful and very useful, and I think in many ways you posed a lot of the questions for the discussion today, and lots of other things were coming even to my mind as you were speaking. I'm now going to ask Anne Connolly, the board chair, and Alan Todd, Assistant Chief Constable for District Policing, just to come up and join the panel. Before I open up to the floor, I want to put a couple of questions to the ACC and board chair, really in a sense of just perhaps responding to what we've heard from Rick. Alan, you've heard from Rick. He has set the narrative in terms of policing in neighbourhood policing in England and Wales. He has said that he went into forces and asked for what their narrative was. Can you maybe tell us a bit about the PSNI narrative and the future of local policing here?
Yes, thanks Amanda, and thanks Rick. It was really thought-provoking presentation. In fact, it's a conversation we as a senior team in PSNI have on a regular basis around how we take this piece forward. The ethos behind neighbourhood policing in PSNI has evolved in some ways along the lines you've seen in the presentation here, because it's just been subject to the same challenges as you've seen in the presentation. But at its heart, we've always believed in the pattern architecture and working with local councils and local bodies and local people, and having a policing structure in terms of service delivery on the ground that was able to match that. The most recent iteration of that was under the review of public administration changes to district structures, when we went from 8 districts to 11 districts, co-terminus with local councils and local areas, which builds the community planning infrastructure, allows that planning with local communities and local outcomes and PCSPs and local bodies to work its way up, but also have a co-terminosity with the delivery structure in terms of policing, so we play a full role in partnership. And so that led to the establishment of the local policing teams. But in addition to that, in areas of particular deprivation, of particular policing challenge, we superimposed what are probably pretty close to purest neighbourhood policing teams, and we targeted those. And sort of half an answer to your question, can you do the universal? Well, actually, when we looked at our numbers, we couldn't physically provide that purest neighbourhood team in every part of Northern Ireland. So a bit like, curiously agreeing with Rick's presentation here, but the outworkings that are the leafy suburbs will not have a dedicated neighbourhood team, because there's not the deprivation, the indicators, the threat, risk and harm, and daily challenges to those communities that require policing response that would justify that when you don't have enough to go around. So the local policing to provide that mixture of response policing, local problem solving, and some local ward ownership, but the bespoke purist neighbourhood teams are more focused on those areas where it's not just our judgment, the collective judgment are where they're most required. Of course, that was then and this is now, and the organisation is smaller again and is projected to get smaller again. And the other piece of which has touched on here, which is really prevalent in our discussion, is that not only is PSNI as an organisation getting smaller, but the nature of risk to policing is changing. And whilst there is an insatiable public appetite for visibility of policing and policing uniforms in local neighbourhoods and local streets, actually many of the threats are moving into cyberspace, online, and those places where policing response is not on the streets and not visible, is more specialised, it's more partnership, it's more technical. So universal provision comes out under even more stress, because sitting in my seat as the Assistant Chief Constable for Local Policing, I am faced with having to make do with fewer officers because we're reducing budgets, but also then field bids from my colleagues who are involved in protecting the community from child sexual exploitation, from drug trafficking, from cybercrime, from really major threat, risk and harm, serious organised crime. All those are growth industries, growth demand. So if we're going to match the growth demand in those areas with additional policing resource, it puts the visible neighbourhood-based piece under even more pressure. And those are the conversations we're currently engaged in.
Okay, thank you, Alan. One of the questions that Rick put up, and I'll maybe just ask the staff if they can put that slide up, because I think actually it was really useful in terms of the discussion points. And picking up on the point that Alan has made in terms of can we do the universal, this was a key consideration for the board in terms of the introduction for the new model. And Rick's presentation had said, should we try and do it everywhere or do it where it is most needed? Chair, can you give us a sense of the board's consideration of that?
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed this because it really did reflect a lot of the discussions we had when we got the new model in 2015. And I can give you the short answer and then I can go into my political answer. The short answer is no, we don't need them everywhere, but the long answer really is that we do need to define what it is, because I mean, I've been on the board over 6 years and people still confuse community policing, local policing teams and neighbourhood policing teams because nobody really knows what they are. And I think people do deserve to know what the difference is. And we were very pleased when the local policing teams were aligned to the districts, but then we got a lot of flack when we were told we're actually there's only going to be 34 neighbourhood policing teams and they will go where our community prioritisation index is. I think that's actually right. If there is an area that needs extra policing, they should get it. There would be areas that definitely don't need it. And we were talking about this earlier, there are areas where, I've said this before, if you saw a police officer in your street, you would wonder why they were there. So why waste the resources there? But to go further than that, we don't need them everywhere. We do need them in some areas. My concern would be, and we've commissioned research, if they're not working in the 34 areas, what is the issue? And I also would like to know what is the evidence that they do work, because I don't know that we've ever really been given that properly either. What do they actually do? And how do we know that they're doing it well? And what should a community expect of a neighbourhood policing? But these are all questions I think are very common, but they're very relevant because we don't really know. Because you'll get people who will say, well, all they do is sit about in Starbucks all day. Whereas we do know that there are skills that are required for neighbourhood policing, which you rightly said, which others may not have. I think we do need to have that debate about how neighbourhood policing officers work, how they're trained, what skills they need. And I really do think that we need to have those discussions around the definitions. But no, we don't need them everywhere. There are places where we definitely need them. We need to be sure that they're doing a good job. And where they're not, we need to know why they're not. And from that point of view, the research which the board has commissioned hopefully will help us to answer some of those questions.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm just conscious that you have mentioned research that we've commissioned, and I'm conscious that we have with us today colleagues from Queen's University in Belfast who are currently undertaking that research. And without putting you on the spot, Joanne or John or Danielle, maybe perhaps you could just give us a sense of what you're hearing in relation to some of the questions that are being posed and maybe some of what Rick has said today as well.
I think what we have found in the research that we're just in the process of completing mirrors very much what Rick has said, and I'll maybe just take you through a few of our kind of headline findings. First of all, knowledge and understanding of the new policing model varies widely. With some of our interviewees were able to articulate in great detail how the model is operationalised and the changes incorporated within it. More often though, interviewees could only offer a very broad description of key changes and felt they were very vague about the detail of it, and they often reported frustration that the model hadn't been well communicated or adequately explained to them. There was broad consensus around a number of issues with generally an overall kind of negative interpretation of the impact of the new model. And the issues really raised, I'll just mention what they are and then say a few words about some of them in more detail. Police visibility, police community engagement, the style of policing from softer policing to harsher kind of what was seen as law enforcement, the loss of neighbourhood policing in many areas, overstretched response policing, partnership working with the PSNI, what was called or defined as kind of continuous or continuity policing, as some people talked about, the ability of the same officers to see an issue through from beginning to end, diminution of trust in local communities, and particularly in the harder to reach communities in Northern Ireland. Just in terms of lower visibility, since 2015 it was mentioned that this was a negative outcome mentioned in almost every response. The absence of locally available officers, taken together with some of the other changes relating to the closure of police stations and confusion or lack of knowledge around the 101 number, are seen to have negatively impacted on the reporting of offences in local areas, and has increased a perception, particularly amongst some of the more vulnerable groups, such as the elderly, that local communities are less safe. There was also a general perception that the loss of neighbourhood teams would have a detrimental effect on police-community relations in some areas, and could lead to an increase in antisocial behaviour and criminality. And trust building and confidence in local officers were cited as kind of key advantages of neighbourhood policing, particularly where it involved that softer getting to know you type engagement. At a practical level, the model is seen as unworkable. The policing districts are now much bigger, and the number of dedicated officers, community police officers, has been reduced. And where there are no dedicated officers, as I said, community policing is undertaken by response teams. And many respondents said there had been a notable change in the approach to policing in their areas, with many more officers adopting a more abrasive approach. And this was attributed to a shift from neighbourhood to response, and was characterised, as they said, by overstretched officers with limited local knowledge, often arriving from some distance away to deal with locally sensitive issues. There was no criticism of individual officers, just the fact that they were now overstretched, and that the community observed that morale within the police was much lower. There was also a view expressed that while soft community policing might be resource intensive at the point of delivery, in the longer term it's likely to be cost saving. This was a view from the community, as preventative work and early intervention policing, particularly with young people, can mitigate the potential in the longer term for disruptive and ultimately harmful behaviour. And it was argued that protecting young people from first engagement with the criminal justice system and offering them timely advice and support can lead to less risky and costly decision making in the future. Another issue that was mentioned was the precarious political context and the ongoing status of Northern Ireland as a society in transition. And these were mentioned as reasons for not moving too quickly to a model of policing that might be seen as reminiscent of times when the police were viewed less as offering a service and more as a state law enforcement agency. There was some resentment also expressed by other agencies, also with limited resources, that they're now having to take up the slack or plug the gaps left by the reorientation of policing away from preventative and early intervention work. And I suppose a final point, the risks in breaking community trust was highlighted on a number of occasions, with some expressing less willingness in their community to support the police, and in some cases this was seen as a return to a former position where communities were unlikely to work with the police, and in that sense then some of the progress that had been made, there's a risk of losing that. So those are the key things emerging from our research. Obviously there's a lot more detail, but those are the kind of headline points.
Okay, Joanne, thank you very much. That's very helpful. I'm very conscious that we've had nearly 3/4 of an hour of been talking at you. So I'm actually, before I ask anybody to comment maybe on what Joanne has said in the panel, I'm going to open it to the floor and see if we can take some of the questions, because I think some of the things will come out from there. We have a couple of questions here, and we have one over here. I'll take these two first, actually. Just if you could actually just stand up and introduce yourself, and just for the purpose of the live stream, use the camera or use the microphone.
No problem, I'm not shy. My name's Steve McGuinness. I represent West Belfast. I'm also an elected member on the West Belfast PCSP. I take all the points very well, and appreciate the presentation, Rick, around neighbourhood policing. But the issue I have is Do you put them in the areas and where do you not put them in the areas and where they're needed, where they're not needed? But the likes of an area like West Belfast, we're broken into 3 DEAs with 3 neighbourhood policing teams. And to be honest with you, every weekend they would all be needed. But the problem that we would have in West Belfast is only one neighbourhood team is on to cover the whole of West Belfast. And realistically, it's never going to happen. It's not working. And through all of our reps within West Belfast, it's a common theme and a common message through the West Belfast PCSP that there's not enough reach, and it is down to resources. It's not down to people not wanting to do it. It is down to the resources in that area. I also go out every weekend with the Safe Neighbourhood Project that we've done that for over 25 years, and we work closely with the PSNI. And we've been saying, you know, where if there's a big focus on, like, say, the Douglas area, the rest of the areas don't have a neighbourhood policing. Or like the Falls Park last weekend, there was no neighbourhood policing in any other areas. You were relying on response, and they don't have the same mindset as what neighbourhood teams do to follow it through. The point I'm making is that, you know, to be realistic about it, we need to have neighbourhood policing on all of those areas at the weekend if we're going to be realistic about trying to deal with antisocial behaviour within West Belfast, because we keep dealing with the same problems time and time again. There is a community confidence issue, not just within the community, but even within the activists who we have on board working with the police. So there's definitely an issue there, and it does come down to what community input we're getting, and we are seeing a decrease in people reporting crime. So I think around community policing and neighbourhood policing, we are making the arguments. We need to sit down and look at a way forward of trying to represent all of those areas at the weekend, or all we want to do is firefight all the time around neighbourhood policing.
Thank you, Stephen. Rick, do you maybe want to come into the questions to you, and maybe Alan, you could respond to the specifics that Stephen has raised as well?
I mean, I think it was interesting what you said about response policing and how there was a different attitude and a different style. And I think that this is one of these things I was talking about, bushcraft. You know, that if you lose, if you don't have people specialising it, do you sort of lose a particular style of policing? And it's interesting that in some of the English and Welsh forces we went to, particularly around multi-agency working, what everyone tends to do is say, well, what's the specific role of the police versus the specific role of social services versus other things? And police tend to fall back on powers, right? So they tend to say, well, we've got warranted officers, we can use our powers to enforce. And so what we've seen in some forces is they've said, we need to work together with all these other agencies better, but then we're going to pull back to an enforcement function. But then, of course, you get the problem that you end up with policing just being about enforcement rather than about prevention and building confidence and building up relationships and so on. So I think there's a real challenge for policing in those kind of multi-agency settings. That if you just fall back on, well, what do the police have that social workers don't have, or housing officers don't have, or other professionals and community organisations don't have, then you tend to fall back on this enforcement thing. But I think there is a danger in that as well for policing if you're thinking about confidence and so on.
Okay, Alan?
Yeah, I'd like to say a few pieces to Stephen, and then maybe just connect that into some of the stuff that comes out of the research on the right here from Queen's. Stephen, I hear that, and I would identify with quite a bit of it. The challenge for somebody sitting in my seat is that the people from East Belfast say exactly the same as do South Belfast and North Belfast. And we're finished with Belfast, all the other commanders around the country want to know why Belfast have all my resources. So, you know, we are pulled in a range of directions around that, and that's not a reason for not addressing it, but it is the reality of pretty much a daily conversation that I have with my commanders at all levels. And of course, whilst Queen's have pointed out to some feedback from partners that there's this perception that police are stepping away and partners are filling the gap, the experience of police is completely the opposite, that we're stepping in the gaps left all the time. And I know there's certainly elements in your part of the city, as there are across Northern Ireland, where cuts to the third sector in terms of budget and funding, we're finding that the partners that we normally turn to on weekends and difficult nights and everything else to spread our influence and to spread that as problem solving just isn't there for us. What people see is a lack of police action, but actually what you're seeing is a lack of action around with partners, because, you know, the number of youth workers and conveners and community workers that are finding funding streams drying up at every turn of the corner is very obvious to us all. And that's just in the voluntary and third sector. The statutory sector, we're finding partners stepping away from us as well because they can't continue partnerships that have been developed over time for exactly the same reasons. So we absolutely share your frustrations. which is why we're currently re-examining our own approach to this to see how we might do this differently and better going forward. At the heels of this, the Patton report recommended 7,500 police for PSNI in circumstances which would have been better than they currently are in terms of the challenges faced by the organisation, and in a time when nobody had even ever thought about cybercrime and less likely child sexual exploitation. So, there's a significant stretch on where we are around this. So I would have a sort of gentle challenge back to some of the research around partners thinking we're stepping away. We're actually finding we're stepping into gaps left elsewhere. I understand the perception of the changing nature in policing between somebody who can spend an hour and a half in tea and biscuit with you. I'm not even going to go to the Starbucks conversation, that's for somebody else's judgment. I always find the donuts and cost as much tastier. Other brands are available in case you think I'm endorsing anybody. So when you get somebody who has 15 minutes to deal with you rather than an hour and a half, there may well be that perception that the police are treating you differently. But I would say that actually complaints of that regard in terms of policing are at their lowest in a long time. They've been a really downward trend for some time. So the data versus reality doesn't always stack up around that. And I'm getting some challenge in the front row here, but these are the challenges that we pose ourselves. And going back to the chair's comment very firmly around that software engagement stuff, which is incredibly valuable in understanding the needs and concerns of local communities. It is expensive. There's no real evidence to say that it's cost saving over time, but it doesn't mean it's not worth doing, because we fall into the trap sometimes of knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And I think we have to challenge our own thinking around that as well. And I absolutely get the perception when people think there's no police station. The reassurance value of bricks and mortar in a local town or local village is very, very high, and when the police aren't there, there's this perception that is damaging to local confidence. I think that the challenge is for us is to increase our visibility. Liz Young's here, head of our corporate comms. What we didn't have 10 years ago were 750,000 people have reached on social media who talk to us in some shape, size or form pretty much every day. And the amount of messaging and the amount of engagement we do both ways on social media has far surpassed what some of the best neighbourhood teams ever did over time. So that is an example of how things are changing in policing and need to change in the future.
Okay, thanks, Anne. I'm going to ask the chair maybe just to comment. There's a theme coming out, but before I do that I want to go to a question, but I'm giving you a heads up. It's around a theme coming out right across the pieces in relation to the resourcing and the increasing demand. And surely just to get a board perspective on that, because Stephen's saying that actually the demand's greater at the weekend, there's a lack of resourcing. We're hearing that from the feedback from Queen's, and Rick and Alan have mentioned it as well in terms of what was originally envisaged in terms of the numbers of policing. But there's a gentleman, I would like to take him first.
Thank you, JJ McGeehan, the councillor just across the road here in Old Park Ward in New Lodge particularly. Couple of things, Rick, thanks very much for the presentation. The wee video was seen at the start, the two police officers talking to the two kids. It's unrecognisable to me. It doesn't happen in New Lodge, it doesn't happen in the Old Park Ward, whereas I've seen it. I think we need to do more of it. We need to do that. We need to get into the communities. We've went backwards since 2015, where we started to get into the communities. We started to get communities to have faith in the PSNI and to work with the PSNI. I think we're slowly but surely losing that there. I think we need to get back there. We need to get back on the street. We need to talk to communities. We need to get into communities. There's no good driving by community or driving through the community no more. We need to get back in there. We need to look at that there. Rick, language is very, very important. I don't think the model in England and stuff is totally compatible with here. I think there is certain elements within that could work. The very fact of using language like a police force, send shivers up your back here. So it does, because of the different narratives that we have here. So, policing here, I believe, is a different policing job. Working in the community with the police here is totally different. But that whole confidence and that whole working out of the policing system starts at the ground and it works up. Unless we're on the ground and we're getting the information from within the ground and building relationships with people on the ground, we are not going to solve the crime problem. And we're going to save a lot of money by solving it early on. We can track people within the New Lodge area who were who we notified the police and all the statutory agencies at the age of 7. They're now 20 odds, and most of them are in jail. at early intervention would have saved the money in jail. We talk about austerity and not enough money. We don't talk about the austerity of jails. We're quite happy to put somebody in jail and spend, what is it, £80,000 a year to keep them in there. But we don't let them out because you say there's not enough money. But we say, well, let's cut back on policing in the community because there's not enough money. I think we're doing it opposite. We need to get into the communities and work in the communities and work from there up. And that's not to go against the people who work in our communities, the police officers. They're fantastic, they do a good job, but they do a good job against the odds. There's not enough of them, and there's not enough of them to do the job that they want to do.
Thanks, JJ. That links actually quite well to the resourcing issue, and also Stephen and JJ's challenge, I suppose, to the panel and to us as a board is around losing the connection at a local level, which is largely a resourcing issue. If you could just come in and comment on that, and maybe if any of the other panel want to say anything in response to that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is, in some areas, a loss of, we've got examples of that kind of image. Starbucks, it was simply to say that a lot of people don't understand that role. Many people don't even value that role. People who have neighbourhood policing probably do, but there's a misunderstanding of the role of neighbourhood policing, which is why I'm back to we need a definition, and we need people to understand the very valuable role they do in proactive policing and preventing people from being there. But not that I ever much give sympathy to the police, but I do. They have taken a big hit in money, and you will not see much on the news about the police service having lost money. You'll know the two biggies, health and education. But I think in the last 3 years, and the deputy will keep me right, it's about £123 million, is it? 180. I mean, that is a lot of money. Now, when that goes, something else has to go. Most of your budget will be spent on people. And the police don't have the luxury if somebody rings on a response to say, well, actually, I can't send somebody. So I could see the cow, or whatever you call it, the bull, I prefer, on the screen saying, you go out, you respond, because that's where you must, that is the must do. You have to respond to the domestic abuse or whatever. And that is not good for the neighbourhood police, which is seen as the softer, not so important. It is important. I always compare it to years ago whenever young kids who couldn't read would have been withdrawn from their large classes to be helped. And the minute somebody was off sick, those classes didn't matter. Those children were just put back in, and the teacher who took them sent off. And that just really annoyed me. And I said, no matter how little money there is, we've got to make sure we do the right thing. But there has been a big decrease in the budget, and that is going to affect numbers. And I don't know if you've seen or looked at the demand wheel, or if you understand it, but if you have a look at that, you'll see the kind of daily demands on the police service. I think it's on your seat on a daily basis. So you balance it with that. But I'm in harmony with the two guys from Old Park and West Belfast. If we can get police officers in to do that preventative work, then further down the line we're going to have less trouble. And maybe we just need a new way of looking at things and stop trying to mend the old ways.
I'm going to go to another question. Albert, I think you were next on the end of the question at the end here.
Albert Spratt, PCSP, North Down. As the local policing teams do not seem to have gained the confidence of the community. I'm PAC chairman on for 7 years, and I have tried to reduce to the meetings, trying to get them to come up and manage what over that for us. I just worked really well 4 weeks ago. I was on the subcommittee of the PCSP. David Lanza was retiring soon. He said, wants to work like Lanza Care, and there's an opportunity to offer you the job. I speak to all the young
Sorry,
people.
Albert, I'm not sure your microphone's working. Just
Where will we start from?
Okay.
I think we can hear you, but we're just struggling to hear you.
Okay, first of all, the local policing teams, they aren't gaining the confidence of the community. I'm PAC chairman now for 7 years, and each time we have a meeting, I try to get the police to bring out what they're actually involved in. It's nearly impossible. Now, I was at the subcommittee of the PCSP a few weeks back. David Lindsay, who's retiring soon, he said, once the week I go into a care home, I take off my uniform, I talk to all young kids about their mistakes. I also show them the way forward, how they can improve. And I think it's actually a PR thing. I think the police are underselling themselves. See, when they're at meetings, if they can actually bring out what they're involved in, then the community can understand we're actually quite involved here. People seem to think they're invisible, they're doing nothing, they're just looking at crime. But police are actually doing quite a lot. And it's bringing that into the domain, public domain, so that people realise we are effective, we're involved in our communities, doing A, B, C and D. And I think that is where it has to come from. A PR angle has been undersold. Thank you.
Okay. Before I get anybody to respond to that, I'm just going to take Michael's question and maybe just pick the two of them up together.
Sorry, I'm Michael O'Hara. I'm an independent custody visitor. I'm also an independent member of the PCSP. So, literally, the resource issue is something that comes up quite regular. I quite enjoy the police and committee meeting as part of the PCSP. I think it's the most informative one, and the police do, in my opinion, do PR themselves. Okay, I hear some very good success stories, but I also hear Stephen and JJ, and they're absolutely right. Perhaps we could bring forward the 24th of January meeting, which is doing more with less, and how the police will optimise the resources to best effect. Because if we keep talking about resource, we're not going to get any more. Okay, it looks like the numbers are what they are, so we can't keep complaining that the resource wasn't there somewhere else. There's very strong structures in place in the local communities, West Belfast, North, South and East. So my question is, are we maximising the PCSPs? Are we maximising the community structures? Can we do more to help?
Thanks, Michael. Could I maybe go to you first in terms of are we maximise the PCSPs? Because what we're hearing actually is a theme today around the connection with local communities. Stephen talking about the dialogue at local level, a challenge from JJ around what's in the video clip isn't the reality, and the two PCSP independent members challenging the resource and the visibility piece.
No, I don't believe we are maximising the PCSPs, and in fact, if you looked at the Omnibus survey yesterday, it was quite disappointing how few people even really understood who they were, what they did, and I think the board has a responsibility to move on that. I mean, also disappointed in some ways when I go to some of the PCSP meetings, and I know Debbie, the Vice Chair's been to a lot, where there's a lack of other statutory bodies there to support. Now, we always get told, why don't you let them? We can't, but they should be there. And the programme for government doesn't ask the police to do everything on their own. It's very clear these are joint ventures with joint outcomes. So we need everybody to be doing their bit. So I think there's a lot more work to be done, and we've got our new director in partnership, No Pressure for you, Adrian, where we need to look at how we build on the very good work which is going on in many of the PCSPs, but how we can make it better, how we can encourage other agencies to come in, because there is no doubt that on a Friday evening, we've seen it, and sometimes it's come from custody visitors, experiences that police officers have on a Friday night because they can't get access to other resources, and they're being taken away maybe to sit for 10, 12 hours in an A&E with a mentally ill person, because that person can't be left, or maybe to look after a looked after person who can't be found to whatever else. So there are major issues there if we're going to move forward. I perfectly agree with you about the resources, and in fact the more resources reduced, the more innovative and creative we have to be, and that's why I said in my last comment I think we need to find different ways of, instead of harking back to how it was, looking at new ways of doing it. And hopefully the research from Queen's and indeed your work will help us to do that. Because there is always, I think particularly in policing, to look at how it was always done. And we won't be able to do it that way in the future. So let's use the PCSPs. I think there's a lot of mileage there that we haven't explored.
Alan, do you want to come in terms of, from a policing perspective, PCSPs, local dialogue with community workers?
Yeah. Thanks for the thinking time, Amanda. I think, Michael, you asked 3 questions. I like straight answers. So resources are as they are. No, they're not. They're going to be smaller, quite a bit smaller over time. And that's the challenge in planning forward. What we have today is not what we're going to have tomorrow, and certainly isn't what we're going to have this time next year. So the pressure's increasing, not staying the same. So we need to plan on that basis, and that's where innovation and creativity comes in. And we need to think that way. Are we maxing PCSPs? No, we're not. And are we maxing community involvement? No, we're not doing that either. And actually, if you go on with your checklist and questions, are we maximising partnership working either in the third sector or statutory partners? No, we're not doing that either. Having said that, it's not all bad news story, because we're doing a significant amount of pilot work within the policeman community piece of work around concern hubs and partnership working and creating a partnership approach to the demand wheel that the chair touched on earlier, because there's lots of numbers on this and they're all really interesting and and it captures some of it. So you'll see that we deal with 35 missing persons a day. Some of those are hugely complex. One of those people that's reported missing today at high risk might be a 5-day investigation, maybe a 2-week investigation for this service. Some might be an hour and a half. 90% of people return within 5.5 hours, but the other 5% are really long, complex, high-risk investigations. So the numbers only tell part of the story, but behind every one of them, there's many, many tragedies in there. The round about 1,500 calls for service is the one I always point people out to. Because of that, when you look at the crimes, somewhere around 16% of the calls for service are actually related to crime. So that's 85% of what we deal with as a police service actually isn't crime related. A big chunk of it is concern for safety or vulnerability. A large chunk of that, we shouldn't be the first call for service, but actually because you have really high confidence levels in policing, because we're there 24/7, because you can lift the phone and get us, here's where they come to. So in the absence of partners stepping into that space and working collectively with us, you're left holding this, which I think a lot of us, frankly, isn't ours to hold, but we do it because that's the organisation we are. We're in the business of keeping people safe and we take that seriously. So that demand wheel sort of gives you a touch into that world. It takes it into a wider planning piece going forward. If we're going to have fewer resources and we're going to work with partnerships and concerned hubs with partners who are also under pressure themselves, is an 11 district structure, our 11 concerned hubs, our 11 times everything, an affordable model for the future? Some of that's a conversation with board members, some of that's a conversation for communities, because the more of those structures we have, the more management costs we have, the more structural costs we have, the more money we spend on management and structure, the less we can spend on having the service provision at the front end. And these are the questions and challenges for how we shape policing in the community, local policing, neighbourhood policing. Define it as you will. Interestingly, there's a definition within the most recent HMIC Peel report on police effectiveness, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, which recommendation 1 outlines a checklist for what success looks like from a neighbourhood policing model. I'm just not sure it's the one we take, but there are elements that I identify with it. But I'm pretty sure if I took a straw poll across PSNI's senior team or the policing board or this room, we'd all have a different perspective on it. But that's a really rich place for conversation.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Rick, I'm probably going to link one of Alan's comments, but just into you mentioned in your presentation about Durham, and that consistently comes out as a high performer in terms of connection with local communities. I know you said that actually it's difficult to get a sense of what that is, but do you have any sense of what makes Durham so good?
That's a complicated question. I think, yeah, it is. It is a small.
You can tell I don't know the geography.
It is, and it's had very. It's a small county. It's got a university town in the middle that probably doesn't have some of the kind of complex issues that we get in some other towns. It's had very consistent leadership, both in terms of the governance and in terms of the chief constable. So I mean, there's lots of different.
So no comparison.
No, I mean it has had consistency, and some of the forces which were most worrying, and the ones that tend to come down at the bottom of the, if you want to call it the league table, the ones that tend to come out pretty badly in HMIC inspections tend to be pretty consistent, and they also tend to have very much consistency. They tend to have rapid changes in leadership, rapid changes in governance, tend to be pretty unstable. Neighbourhood policing, we were working in Bedfordshire where they pulled out completely out of neighbourhood policing, then they realised they made a mistake and they've gone back in, and it switches and changes all the time. And the problem, I think the fundamental problem is you get into a cycle there, because no one wants to go and work in a place which has constantly got problems, and so what you end up with is the people who do get in there don't have enough time to make a difference, and you get this cycle of sort of instability. So I think consistency has a lot to do with it. To be consistent when the budget's being cut very dramatically, but I think you do have to try to not sort of chop and change.
I think actually, in fairness, that probably resonates quite a lot, because the feedback that we would get from PCSPs was around consistency and commanders, and you build a relationship on, and then there's a new model introduced and they come out. So I do think there's a challenge there for both the policing board, the PSNI, and for PCSPs and local commanders. I'm going to go, there's a question here, and then we have another one here, and I'm conscious that we're starting to get into our closing. questions, but I do reiterate that we will be available afterwards. Linda.
Thank you. Linda Dillon, MLA from Mid-Ulster, also former member of the Policing Board. Hopefully we'll be back there. Suppose that inconsistency actually feeds into one of the points that I was going to make, because it has been raised with me of constituents and by people in our party who are on the PCSPs and so on, around the inconsistency not only in commanders but at all levels, and that really does feed into some of the problems that they're having in dealing with the neighbourhood issues and the community issues. And I suppose the question for yourself, Alan, is have the police got any, or PSNI leadership got any innovative ideas on how they're going to manage that in the future? Because that is very important, I think, going into the future if you want to be serious about taking leadership. Just also, Alan, you'd raised that the perception around neighbourhood teams and perception around response, that there are less complaints. I would fear there are less complaints because people start to wonder, what's the point in complaining? I'm not saying that's absolute, but I think there's an element of it there. Also, there definitely is an issue in relation to neighbourhood police and response teams, and the neighbourhood police teams feel it as much as the people who are on the other end of that, because they're having to pick up the mess that is left behind. We have some really good examples of neighbourhood policing, police who are working well in their community, who have built up confidence. Response teams come in on a given evening or weekend and absolutely shatter that, and it only takes one bad comment on Facebook and you'll get 50 bad comments underneath it, regardless of all the good experiences that they've had of good neighbourhood policing. So I think that needs to be looked at, and looked at in a serious way. And just the last comment I'll make is resources is an issue. I sat on the policing board, I know it's an issue. I know it's an issue for every single department out there and for every single organisation, whether they're statutory, voluntary or government. But the fact is, you have to look at where you are directing your resources. And are we directing them in the right place? And are we looking at local policing and neighbourhood policing as the soft option all the time, and giving all of the resources to what would be seen as the hard end of policing? So I think we need to seriously look at that, because your community, and JJ's already said it, your community is where it begins and ends. You know, and even if you, regardless of what you're talking about, whether it's sexual crime, whether it's drugs, whether it's cyber crime, you're going to get the best information on all of that crime from within your community. But you're not going to get it from them if they don't feel that they can trust you or they have a relationship with you.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Before I ask the panel to respond, I would specifically Alan to respond. There's quite a lot in there. I was tempted to give him the most difficult one in terms of whether there's any innovation there, but I'll let him decide how he's going to answer them. I would like just to take the question here, and then we'll finish up with questions and get the panel just to close with the two questions together.
Thanks very much. Matt Garrett, I'm a member of the Belfast PCSP, member of the West Belfast DPCSP, an elected member in West Belfast. To pick up on a few points, Alan at the very beginning talked about the core values of policing emanates back to the Patton report and core values around community policing. And then Rick, if I looked at the first slide that you put up around whenever a crime occurs, the same 6 people turn up, and it was a photograph of the same 6 police officers. And while there has been some moves in the right direction in respect of neighbourhood policing, it's already been made, the point's been made here today, that is damaged whenever the response team is amalgamated and you don't always get the 6 same faces or the same neighbourhood team. But JJ made a point that it works both ways. It works both from the ground up in the neighbourhood police right up to the commanders, and you made the point yourself. In West Belfast in the last 5 years, I think that there's been 5 different commanders. So if we're going to look at community policing, it does have to work both ways. Neighbourhood policing works both ways, from the top to the bottom, and I do think that we do need to see an emphasis on more neighbourhood, good policing. We talked about the tea and biscuit. It does work, it works, and I think that we need to do more of it.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Linda. Alan.
Yeah, not to blame West Belfast a bit on this. He's worked so well with local commanders; they'll get promoted and leave. You know, if they weren't so successful, we'd keep them where they were. You know, and that's sort of tongue in cheek. But the places that have the highest needs tend to get really good engaged people. Good engaged people tend to move up and through the organisation, and it's a frustration on one level because we understand the continuity and how that works. but now they can use step across people's prospects in the organisation, and I'm sure that's a challenge for every organisation in this room. And I wish I could offer you some succour around the continuity piece and the consistency piece. But we're moving into a part of our profile as an organisation where lots of people joined policing 30 years ago. 2017, at the end of this year, into 2018-19, with the pension regulations, we'll see somewhere in the region of 350 to 400 police officers a year leaving the organisation for the next 2 years. Recruiting and training student officers flat out barely keeps us even. Most of those new officers will go to local teams, and the turnover, just by sheer demographics, I can't offer you, I'm not going to make you false promises around it, because I just know that's a challenge that we face as an organisation over the next 2 to 3 years. There's hardly, we had a conversation this morning about changes in command teams brought about by enforced selection, and the deputy and I were at pains just to make one move, because once you make 2, you make 5, and the consistency right across our business is important to us. So that was a conversation with Barbara, the deputy, myself, and others around the table this very morning. So we do take that seriously and upfront in our decision making. The piece about are we spending our money in the right place, Linda, there's always this tension, and I don't pretend to have the magic formula around it, but when you're in the business of keeping people safe, we do need to what looks like threat, risk and harm, where the serious threats and harm come to from people. And that's where you get a lot of the specialist teams around online crime, major fraud, sexual crimes, child sex exploitation, people being extorted with pictures online, all those growth areas that we'll have seen, we hadn't heard of 5 years ago, but that's where the real harm and damage is done. That's where people are taking their own lives and are finding it roots. So clearly we have to invest in that. And that's in tension, because most of the people in this room, most of the communities we work in, community is us, and Rick's the expert in this, but I know enough about the background of this. Our average community, as we perceive it and know it, for any one of us is about 500 square metres. The nearest shop, the nearest bus stop, a dozen neighbours either side, that's the place we know really well. It starts to get a bit fuzzy beyond that, and that's where we make our judgments about, do we see the police here, is it safe here, and then some people have a wider perspective. So it tends to be the stuff that happens in that really small area that concerns us, because it affects us, we see it, and it impacts us in our day-to-day lives. And the tension between policing that space and policing the serious harm space is always a tension, and there's always going to be a balance. Because we could spend the entire police budget on serious threat, harm and risk, and serious and organised crime and all that piece of business. You could spend it all there and still we wouldn't meet the demands there, so we do have to find a way to balance that, and those are conversations and perspectives we need to take as we go along. I don't pretend to have the magical formula to it, but I do know, as we've shrunk as an organisation, all areas of the business have had to give up something to make it work. So it's not a case of we're always the poor relation and we're always giving up, but there is invariably a shift, and all the academics are telling us about this shift, about threats to the public moving from the visible space to the invisible space, and policing responses moving from the visible policing presence to the technical. I hear loud and clear stuff around local policing teams and whether or not they're working. I think we have innovation around that. I think we have some innovative ideas we need to look at. I think within that there's going to be some asks of communities. I think there's going to be some asks of people in this room. We're going to need to have some discussions about what works for us, what works and what doesn't work. But one of the reasons LPTs are under stress is because all the calls for service go to the LPT, and we're just running from call to call to call. And if you create an environment where every officer going to a call has 3 or 4 queued, that puts the officer under stress. They get short. None of us work well in that environment. None of us are our best in that situation. We generally don't give of our best, so it shouldn't be a surprise if police officers, being human beings like the rest of us, suffer from some of that. We have put our toe in the water before around scheduling calls and doing more station appointments rather than house calls. Some of those have the answers to creating space for the service delivery model. They may be hard choices. Doctors stopped doing house calls many, many years ago. The police still do. But it means 3 or 4 officers, or 2 or 3 officers depending on the area, going to a house and spending 3 people spending an hour there dealing with somebody, or 45 minutes dealing with somebody, where the one officer could deal with it at the station, particularly in an urban environment when stations are close by, and free up the rest of that resource and actually have time to give you the service that you need to deal with that. These are the sorts of choices about scheduling your attendance with police at a station at a time that suits you rather than suits us in time to call. And those are the wider service delivery pieces, because if you grasp that nettle, then you can create space within the local policing teams that they're not chasing from call to call to call to call, and they're not under all the pressure all the time. They have more time to spend with members of the public and more time to deliver that service. These are the debates that we need to be into, because we can't continue. Even if we just didn't want to change it, the reducing budgets will drive some of these processes anyway, and we need to have a mature debate around how we deliver that across. You'll always get an emergency service when you need an emergency service, and indeed priority one when you need priority. But there's another 50% of our business from the demand wheel that tells us it's not crime, it's not urgent, it's not now. And if we deal with that over the next 24 to 48 hours in a way and at a time that would suit you, giving you some choices around that, use that to protect some of the time that we would normally do the tea and biscuits piece, because we're not getting to do that at the minute because we're running from call to call to call. And that's a very ripe area for debate in the model and the way forward.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate there was a lot in there. I am going to take one final question because I didn't actually catch Barbara was waiting to put a question, and then I'm going to just wrap up after Barbara's question.
It's three points. First of all, absolutely what Linda's saying, and it came out in the research as well. When violence goes down, reports go down. So don't pat yourself on the back, and the fewer complaints, it probably means people are giving up, because people are still coming to us to give out about it. So. Secondly, on you could spend the whole lot on these big questions, and still the answer to that isn't to keep spending even more, but to understand that while you're spending that, and nobody's saying you don't tackle them, but it's like saying, as a former health minister, and I know some of the police get annoyed with me when I say, you didn't ever say, I will only spend on big hospitals, and I won't spend on health promotion, and I won't spend on children's homes. You have to carve out a part of your budget for a significant enough part, always for the soft end, or everybody will drift to the hard end, and you'll spend more and more money on that all the time. And last thing, and I don't have a response to this, it's just a question, and it's both to yourself and Rick, and I don't need the answer right now today, but this whole question of people being promoted and moving on, do they always have to move on? You have to have, on the one hand, if people who are good at neighbourhood don't get promoted, you won't get people who are good going into neighbourhood. That's obvious. But what isn't obvious is that it always has to mean that they then move away and that those skills are lost. So how do you tackle that? And is there anywhere else that you know of through your research that has been solved?
Thanks, Barbara. I'm going to ask each of the comments. I'm going to start with Rick to give Alan thinking time.
I'll take it now.
Are you sure?
I think the police reward structure is outdated. I have thought that for a long time. I don't think it rewards the things that we reward as an organisation, and it's a much bigger conversation than me, but I've thought for a long time it's a bit counterproductive in places. So, but that's a wider debate, and you see some of this coming through in some of the local language from College of Policing and others about how you reward people for doing things and staying doing things that are important to policing. You and I could both argue that the complaints figures either way. The police are damned to the do and damned to the don't, the complaints figures, and that's just a right place for debate. So, no issues around that. I forget the middle point, Barbara, but there was an important part of it.
If you don't spend on the soft end, it will always move to the hard
I know I've been poor mouthing all afternoon around this, and it's something I want. Sometimes the deputies here, and I wouldn't want them to think I get it too easy. So I know I've been doing a bit of poor mouthing. We shouldn't forget, in the wider context, and this is not about me, but in District Policing Command, I command more officers in the organisation and more resource in the organisation than any of the other teams. So it is where we spend money, and we shouldn't forget that.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Would you like to maybe just comment on some of the last points that were made?
I think Michael hit the nail on the head. We were jumping forward to jump back, because really, it's rather than just discussing neighbourhood policing and in isolation of all the other functions of business, it really is a time. I know the police regularly do look at what they do, but I think it's time for a different kind of mindset and a different look at how money is being spent and how things are being done. And if police don't have to do it, don't do it. Do the things that you really need to do, and neighbourhood policing is certainly one of them.
Okay, thanks, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, in response to Barbara's point, I mean, I think there is this idea of developing from the College of Policing dedicated sort of practitioner, I think advanced practitioner, I can't remember the title, but to try to develop career structures which are specialist in particular areas and where officers can spend more time. I think it's hard to do in neighbourhood policing because it's a lot of officers and so on, but clearly it's some attempt to prevent that classic problem of everybody just having to go at the management hierarchy, which is what happens in a lot of organisations. So they are trying to pilot that at the moment. So I think that's something to watch out for. And they're not just doing it with neighbourhood policing, they're doing it with some other specialist areas as well. I think, one thing that I just reflect on towards the end is the dialogue between the community and the police here, because, and we've talked about shifting demand, and certainly from the stuff I've looked at in England around what the public think the police should prioritise, it tends to be the traditional things, so that if you say to members of the public, well, what do you think the police should be prioritising? They'll say, catching criminals, dealing with antisocial behaviour, the sort of traditional stuff that dealing with traditional crime, for want of a better word. But it was interesting because there was a survey done where they actually reflected back to the public the demands that the police were actually facing, including missing children, including dealing with high harm, vulnerability, domestic abuse. And actually, when they were given that list, the public prioritised the same things that the police would prioritise, actually, which is high harm. They said, well, of course you should focus on children. Of course you should focus on vulnerable people. Of course you should focus on repeat victims. So that I think the public understands that when you've got that torrent of demand coming at you, a lot of it with repeat victims, repeat offenders, repeat areas which have very complex problems, if people understand that that's where the resource needs to be focused, I just think often people don't know that that's what the police have to do. I think if you sat a lot of people in a police control room, they'd be really surprised by the stuff that comes through, the amount that's related to mental health, the amount that's related to children going missing from care homes, all of this sort of stuff which it doesn't fit with stuff they see. When you see the police on the TV in programmes and films and so on, that's not what you see. So I think there's a bit of a thing about, maybe it's about the police opening the doors or showing the nature of the demand, and then having a conversation with people so that people really can then say, yeah, in that context, I know I can't expect a visible officer, every day sort of patrolling the street. But it's that thing about policing. It's an ongoing dialogue with the community. But I think there's a role to try to spread more information about the nature of the stuff that's being faced, and the online stuff, because it's not visible, because it's not around on your street corner, because it's not there. The fact that your kids might be more at risk on their laptops than hanging around on street corners. I mean, most people would think they'd be more at risk in the street. Well, they might be highly at risk in their bedrooms. But I don't think that's the public perception yet. So I think it's a conversation that has to be taken.
Thank you very much, and that leads me nicely on to closing with just a reminder in terms of the next seminar, which we rescheduled to Thursday the 26th of October. It was originally billed as the Wednesday, but that's to facilitate Dr. Helen Beckett, who will talk to us about child sexual exploitation. Can I just finish by thanking everybody for coming today? Thank you for your contributions. It's certainly a debate that I think we need to continue on with. I think probably trying to do this within a couple of hours, and I know the staff did put 3 clocks in here for me, and I still managed to go over time. So I appreciate you sitting on beyond the time scale. Thank you.